Hello and welcome back to my somewhat manic pursuit to create an entire wardrobe worth of Bridgerton or Regency inspired clothing. In the previous videos in this playlist, which I think should be in this corner, I made this nightgown and dressing gown inspired by Daphne Bridgerton and Philippa Featherington. If you're interested, check those out. In today's video, we'll be making stays. I have drafted my own pattern for Regency short stays in the past, but this time I decided to make it a little bit easier on myself, and I bought this 2-pack of stays from Red Threaded off of Etsy. Today we'll be making the short stays. I'll be using this lovely floral white brocade for the outer layer, as well as a white cotton and a fusible lining. Let's get started.
Okay, I wanted to switch up the background music and didn't realize quite how ominous that one sounds. It's still really pretty though. Anyways, I started off this project by cutting out each of my pattern pieces in my white cotton and then again in my brocade. Then I laid out all of my cotton pieces wrong side up on a flat surface and kind of puzzle pieced them as best as I could to get them as close together as possible. Once I was satisfied with the positioning, I took my fusible interfacing and laid it directly on top of those panels with the sticky or fusible side facing the fabric. Then I set my janky old iron to its hottest setting, which at this point is basically just lukewarm. I ironed the interfacing until it was actually sticking to the fabric, and then cut out all of the pattern pieces one more time to separate them. This pattern calls for flatlining, which means each pattern piece needs to be matched wrong sides together between its outer and its lining layers. So I pinned around all of the wrong edges of every single pattern piece, then I used a straight stitch to sew all around each of those edges, and finally, to finish them all off, I took them to my serger to repeat that same process one more time. Flatlining is tedious to say the least, but it does leave a rather clean result. The next step is to add the gores for the bust, which are pairs of these little triangle pieces that'll sit next to each other, 2 on each side. I transferred the marks from the pattern, and then needed to make slashes where we would put each of those gores. But because there's multiple layers here, if we just put the cuts in right now, we would end up with a lot of frayed material. So instead, I sewed a straight basting stitch, where the slash will eventually be, then set my machine back to its regular length, and sewed about 1/8 an inch around either side of that basting stitch slash. Not only will this help keep our 2 layers together, it'll also serve as a really handy guide for the next step in the process. You just have to make sure that you maintain your even distance from that bias stitch and bring it to a nice point at the end of the slash. And this is what that looks like up close. Even though we've been preparing for it, it's still so nerve-wracking to take scissors and cut giant holes. But now we have room in our bodice for those gores. Before we officially start sewing those triangles in place, it's really helpful to take your slash mark and the raw edge where the basting stitch was and fold it over to where the straight stitch is, and then iron that all in place for each gore. Because we're going to be top stitching next, this ensures that all of our raw edges are tucked inward towards the lining instead of peeking out. Though it is worth noting that it can be a bit tricky to get the very point of the triangle to lay flat, so you might have to fiddle with it a little bit. But now we're ready to bring those gores in. Since we're just top stitching this, all we need to do is match the top edge of the gore with the top edge of the bust, and then pin all the way around along the seam allowance of our triangular insert. This is as good a point as any to mention that if you're making stays of any kind, it's always best to do a little mock-up. You can run through the motions with a cheap muslin, and that way you know that this is actually going to fit you. It can be a bit tricky to get everything to fit right with a standard pattern, especially when you introduce gores into the bust. That being said, I didn't make a mock-up and just happened to get lucky with this pattern, but it could have been a real crash and burn otherwise. With this all pinned up though, we're ready to start our top stitching. I'm using my regular stitch length and sewing as close to that folded edge as possible without dropping onto the gore. Once I'd sewn all the way down one side, I reinforced my stitch at the point and came back up the other side. Then to make sure everything is nice and secure, the pattern also recommends repeating this one more time about 1/8 of an inch further inward so that you have 2 parallel stitches going all the way around the insert. I gotta say, at this point I was thinking that this was already looking pretty dang cute. After sewing all 4 gores in place, it was time to move on to the boning. I typically use Ridgeline, which is just a cheap plastic boning, but I decided to be extra fancy for this project, and I actually ordered steel bones from corsetmakingsupplies.com. I also ordered everything for my long stays, which is the next video, so sneak peek!
It's so pretty. This is the busk. It's rosewood. It smells a little bit like cat pee. It's gonna go outside for a bit first, but busk. And then we have the boning. We've got pre-cut spiral and straight, depending on
the section of the bodice. I am equal parts very excited and a bit nervous to use this. For these short stays, we need a bit of twill tape, some bones ranging from about 4 to 5 inches, and the one pattern piece that we've ignored up to now, which is this little rectangle. This will hold our center front bones, and to prepare it, I folded down the long edges once and the top short edge twice, then ironed it. At this point, it was just a matter of matching all of the places that the pattern wanted bones with either that little rectangle or pieces of twill tape. I debated a bit whether I was supposed to put that rectangle on the inside or the outside of the fabric, but ultimately landed on the inside. I'm not entirely certain if that's correct, but it gives a cleaner look, I think. For all the twill tape casing strips, I marked the top and the bottom of one side of the line from the paper pattern onto my fabric pattern, and then transferred that over to the matching piece on the left or right side of the bodice. Then pinned my tape along the lines and cut it down to size. Sticking with just my regular straight stitch, I sewed all of the long edges of my casing in place, leaving the short edges open so that I can slide my boning in later. This process can take a while. Luckily, Evan and Caitlin had just posted a very long live stream. For the final boning along the back edge, I folded the center back in about 1.5 inches, then used the overlap of the fabric to create 2 new channels, one at the new center back and one at the edge of the overlap. With all the boning channels that fall in the middle of pattern pieces in place, the next step was to sew all of the pieces together along their matching side seams. So I pinned all of the pieces together simultaneously, then brought my very pokey set of stays over to the machine to sew them in place. Some of the side seams themselves are boning channels, so after those panels were sewn together, I folded the seam allowance towards the center back and top stitched in place so that there was a channel between the layers. At that point, we were finally done sewing all of those boning channels, so it was time to get the steel in place. The red threaded sewing guide makes it really clear which boning you need in which channel, whether it's spiral or straight and how long. So if you order the pre-cut bones and follow the guide, assembly is really straightforward. At this point, we're almost done with our stays. The second to last step is binding all of our raw edges. I made bias tape out of my brocade fabric, then matched one raw edge of my bias tape to the back side wrong edge of my straps and sewed all the way around, cutting it to the length that I need. Then I folded the bias tape over to the right side and top stitched all the way around about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of that fold. The straps were definitely the hardest part to bind. And you also might want to make yours a little bit longer than the pattern recommends. After binding the skinny, curvy straps, the relatively straight edges on the top and bottom of the stays were very easy to bind. Again, just starting by sewing your bias in place on the wrong side of the fabric, and then flipping it over with the fold to the right side. Luckily, I was in very good company for the duration of the binding process. And she even let me use my foot pedal, instead of laying on it. Once all of the raw edges were finished off, the back of the straps needed to be sewn in place. I matched them right sides together based on the marking from the pattern, then top stitched in the same place that I had sewn the bias binding to try and hide those stitches on the bodice. Make sure you like the position before you sew it in place. The last step in this project are the lacing holes. I have an eyelet press that punches the holes for me. Then I take my little eyelet and stick it into that hole that we just made and use the press to crunch it in place. Then I just had to repeat that step a whole bunch more times, and the stays were finally finished. As a bonus, I didn't even have to buy the ribbon because I happened to have some handy from a thrift store. Now we're at the point where you might be wondering why this video has another 6 or so minutes. As I was cleaning up the project, I noticed that I had a rather large amount of the material left over, so... Would have been great if I still had this material when I ran out of binding for my second set of stays, but instead we're making shorts. And we're doing it the simple way, where I take a pair of shorts that I already like and copy them. I folded my shorts in half so that I have access to the front and the back crotch seam. Then I lined it up so that all of the edges of my shorts were the back panel, and cut it out using a seam allowance and a little bit of extra room on the bottom edge. Kate Charmer's shorts in season 2 have a straight back waist, so the back panel was really easy to cut out, but the front of the shorts has a bit of a V shape towards the center front. So I adjusted my shorts to get front seam only, and cut about halfway up the crotch seam before moving on to cut the bottom edge and the sides of the shorts. When I made it up to the waist, I cut a diagonal edge from the crotch seam up to the top of the waist. This left me with my 2 front panels coming to a point. I used my cutout front and back panels to position my fabric for a waistband, folding the fabric in half and in half again so that there wouldn't be a seam in the center or the top. And the final shape kind of reminds me of a fancy belt. I did the same thing for my back panels, but this was just a straight across rectangle waist. So I folded the fabric again and made sure it was about the same height as the waist on the front. After a quick bit of cutting, all of my panels for the impromptu shorts were complete. To begin assembly, I matched up my right panels front and back and my left panels front and back, going all the way up the inside seam, but stopping about 3 inches from the waistband on the outside seam, which gives us room for 2 side openings like Kate's shorts. I folded the front and the back waistband together, right sides facing, and pinned their short edges as well. After that, it was time to sew that all in place. I started off with the 2 waistbands, then moved on to the outside edge of the shorts, again making sure to leave that side opening on the top. Then, with absolutely excellent cinematography, I stuck the 2 shorts inside of each other, right sides facing, and pinned all the way along the crotch seam. Not that you can necessarily see it in the beginning, because I put the pin cushion directly in front of the camera. It was like 11 o'clock at this point, so I wasn't putting in as much effort into the filming. After it was all pinned in place, I moved back to the sewing machine to sew 1 seam allowance away, just with a straight stitch all along that crotch seam from the center front to the center back. At this point, we have some pretty gnarly raw edges left on our side seams, so I took a bit of bias tape and matched one edge up to the wrong side of the fabric, or at least I would have if I had been thinking correctly. I sewed that side in place, and then folded the bias tape over, and top stitched the other half as close to the folded edge as I could get it. After the bias was sewn in place, I folded the shorts right sides together and created a little point on the bottom edge. Next up, I hemmed each leg of my shorts by folding the bottom edge up 1/2 inch, and then 1/2 inch again, and sewing in place about 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge. To attach my waistbands, I sewed 1/2 of each waistband to the wrong side of the shorts, then folded the right side of the waistband up 1 seam allowance and top stitched it in place. How many times in a voiceover can I say that I stitched something in place before my brain comes up with a new phrase? I'm curious, have you been keeping count? Because I definitely have in my head and it's deeply irritating me. Please don't actually keep count, it would be truly horrifying. Anyway, back to the sewing project. To avoid having to make buttonholes, I used an elastic cord that has loops on it by just matching up the top edge and sewing along the length of it. To make sure the 2 sides matched, I counted the number and placement of each of the loops and copied that over onto the strip that I used to create the opposite side. Which unfortunately brings us to the hand sewing part of this project, in which I have to make so many buttons stay on these shorts. Hand sewing is awful, and the people who really commit to historical sewing by only using their hands are crazy. But, also super cool and incredibly talented people that I could never have the patience to be. After finishing the buttons, I realized a critical error. I'd failed to acknowledge that the shorts I was using as a reference had an elastic waistband. So I added some little matching darts along the front waist and the back of the shorts. I folded the shorts in half and then in half again to mark the center of each quarter, then pinned the fabric together about 1 inch from each of those points, and used a diagonal straight stitch to take off that little bit of extra material. Luckily, it was an easy fix, so after the darts were sewn in place, my shorts were officially done, and so was this project.